Hello. I hope everybody can hear me, all 2 or 3 people that are watching. I don't see any indicators on my microphone bar, though. That's kind of strange. All right, I'm just going to assume everybody can hear me and get started. So welcome to this live stream. Talk about construction in Ecuador. It's something that a lot of people ask many questions about. I'm constantly responding to questions about construction here, both from people who maybe want to build a house, their own house at one of the communities here, or just people who want to move to Ecuador on their own and build a house somewhere else. And there's a lot of interesting things to consider. And obviously there's some differences between building on the coast, building in the Andes and the higher elevation, and building here in the Amazon region, and even different parts of the Amazon region, because we're in like a not as humid, not quite as wet as the Amazon basin. So there's differences there. So when I talk about climate, I'm mainly going to talk about the Amazon region. So first thing that would be worth talking about are common contractor mistakes, common building mistakes that happen that you should be aware of. Because when you build in, say, the United States or Canada or a European country, you can assume the builder is a legit professional, has a license, follows the code for the most part. And there's going to be building inspectors from the state, from the government, that come and check at multiple steps of when the building is being constructed to make sure everything's being done correctly. In Ecuador, you don't have that. And you also have a lot of more kind of amateur builders. Even builders that have been making houses for 30 years are still kind of in the amateur stage, in that they do things in a kind of shortcutty kind of way, as cheap as possible. They skip some important things. And I saw a video a couple months ago. Someone sent me a video by some guy in Vilcabamba, or I think it was from Vilcabamba, and it was like the top 10 mistakes. Maybe it was from other city in Ecuador, but it was an expat guy saying like the top 10 mistakes they make in Ecuador in construction. And I don't really agree that the 10 things in that video were the top 10 mistakes that are made. Sorry, tapping my microphone because I still just don't see any green bars on this microphone indicator here, which is kind of strange. I hope people can hear me. I hope someone will say something in the chat if they can. Anyways, continuing. So in that video, it talked about things like the windows not being sealed around. Like they'll install the windows and they won't install the caulk around the windows after that, which is very easy to do. But to me, that's not a really big deal. I mean, it's important, but that's not something that's going to destroy. Oh, thanks. All right, people can hear me. That's not something that's going to cost you thousands of dollars, or no, that's not something that you just can't do afterwards. There are things that literally, like for example, not putting a vapor barrier under the cement footings of a building that has a concrete floor. That's something you cannot do after. If they didn't do that, that's it. If they don't put caulk around the window, you go to the store and you buy a $4.50 tube of silicone sealant, and you pay one of your workers to do it afterwards, after the window contractor leaves. So it's not ideal if the window contractor doesn't do that. But if he doesn't, that's not whatever. If they don't put a vapor barrier into the house, that's a big thing. So the vapor barrier by default, contractors in Ecuador, when they're building a concrete floor under a house, so you have your footings and you have the concrete slab, and you build the house on top of that, whether the house is of wood or concrete or brick or any other material. Under the cement floor, under the concrete floor, you're supposed to have certain things, for example, below foundation drainage and the vapor barrier, which is a sheet of thick plastic that's supposed to stop vapor from water from going up into the cement and then going up into the cement or brick walls and causing fluorescence or mold problems or whatever. The default is they just do not do that. And a lot of them don't even know how, all right? And below foundation drainage, they also don't do that, all right? There are situations, and the below foundation drainage is just where you have perforated pipes underneath the foundation of the house that are wrapped in like a cloth, landscaping cloth or whatever, and then with gravel around it. All right, and that's supposed to, any water that's coming up from the ground up against the foundation, ideally it'll drain into that pipe slowly and go out. There's actually they automatically by default won't do that. There are some situations in which I won't do that. The only situation I can think of is that when I won't do that with a cement floor is if I know the person with a concrete floor is never planning on putting any cement walls in the future. If it's just going to be an open walls, like a pavilion type thing, there's not a huge, and especially if it's not in a really wet area, there's not a huge need, just because you don't have to worry about the water being sucked up into the cement walls and leaving this like fluorescence along the lower part of the walls, which is, you'll see that in a lot of Ecuadorian houses, because they just don't do either of those things, the vapor barrier or the below foundation drainage. By the way, while I'm talking about all this stuff, if anybody has any questions about the topic that I'm currently talking about, you can say it below. Or if you have a question about some random other topic that's related to construction, you can also say it in the chat, but I'm not going to respond to it right away until I get to the topic. So those are two things they do wrong. Another thing they do wrong are stairs, especially in rural areas. If you're doing stairs out of wood, the contractors the construction workers, even the master carpenters generally are not going to know how to properly do stairs. So you're going to have stairs with weird measurements, or the top step will be just lower or higher than it should be, or the bottom step will be like this, and the rest of them are like all the same like that. Like the little overhang you usually do on wood steps will not be there. So if you want proper steps like what you're used to, you have to get somebody who knows to actually design the measurements of the step. The stairs are probably the thing I pay the most attention to if we're building a house here. I make sure to give them a very detailed diagram of the exact measurements, and then I have to be there while they're starting to cut them, so that way if there's any issues, they know. Anyways, I've lost a stair stringer or two. They're expensive pieces of wood, and the stair stringer is like that. The workers that do cement stairs in concrete buildings, they're more likely to have experience with doing those properly, but it's still a good idea to make sure, like check what measurements they're using on the stairs, because you'll see really funny things happen. And what are other things that I can think of that people do? Strange things they do on the houses. If you want really nice finished carpentry work, you have to make sure that your construction people know that, because otherwise their default is, a lot of times, especially in rural areas and rural houses, their default is just do it quick and cheap. If you want joinery in the post and beam construction, you have to make sure you explain what kind of joinery you want. Otherwise, their default will just be to cut all wood at a 90-degree angle, stick it on, 5-inch nail, bam, 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 that's it, which works, and it's cheap. It also depends how much money you want to spend, because you can build a really cheap wood cabin for $2,000 or $3,000, or you can have a really nice finished wood cabin that has a solar system and water and a kitchen and granite counter and a bathroom and a shower and hot water heater for $20,000, $30,000. So there's a huge price range depending on the level of finishing it. I think I thought of up to 10 things to replace the list of 10 things I saw in that original video, 10 things that people do wrong, that construction workers do wrong here, but I can only think of a few of them right now. But yeah, definitely the main ones are for concrete floors, the vapor barrier, the under foundation drainage, and doing stairs incorrectly. I've had master carpenters not know how to install doors, hinges, and doorknobs correctly. So make sure you don't assume things. Don't assume that the people that you're hiring to build a house know how to do the thing that you hired them to do. They may have experience doing basic rustic houses, especially in rural areas, but they may not necessarily know how to hang a door properly. In that case, it's a good idea to have a door person come, not have your regular carpenters that are building the house and then have a door person come and do the door. So of course, that's a good idea. Okay, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about contractors versus subcontractors versus day labor. And so if you're going to build a house, obviously you can either hire your own workers and pay them every day, like pay them per day, or you can contract out the whole project, which is probably a bad idea, or you can be the general contractor yourself and subcontract out different parts of the project, or you can do a combination. You can hire people, day laborers, to do, and your foreman, of course, to do most of the construction, but then for certain aspects of it, you can hire subcontractors, and that's what I think is the best approach in many cases, if you have knowledge of construction. Because, for example, a lot of the general framework and roof work and stuff like that is harder to get an accurate idea of exactly how much labor it's going to be, especially if you're not doing a standard design. So in that case, it can be better to do day labor. But then for windows and doors and gutters and cabinetry and installing ceramic and porcelain floor tiles, plastering cement walls. Those are all kinds of things that you can find subcontractors who will tell you how much they charge per square meter or per meter to do things like that. So oftentimes that will be cheaper. Now, people that don't have as much experience here will tell me things like, oh, well, it's always cheaper to do it by contract because they're going to give you one price and that's it, and which it can be cheaper to do it by contract, but there are other times when it's not. So you don't just assume that one is better. But they say it's always cheaper because if you hire people per day, they're going to purposely work slowly to get the job done in more time, so they get paid longer, so they have a job for longer, right? And there's some flaws in that. Because, for example, when I'm doing projects, I'm usually working with the construction workers that know they're going to continue to be employed after this project. Like, they know we're building house after house. Well, right now we're building 4 different houses at Freehaven. So workers generally have an idea of whether their work is going to be done when the house is done or not. So if you have workers that are going to continue to be employed after that, and they're not worried about, they're not trying to prolong the project so they don't lose their job. You know, they know their job is secure. So in some situations, you don't even have to worry about it at all. And other times they simply are honest and they will work as hard and as fast as they can. Another problem is people who haven't done much construction work themselves, they always underestimate how much time it's going to take to do a certain task. Oh, that'll be half an hour. It's something that takes 2 days, right? I've seen ridiculous underestimations in that regard. So there's not any truism. If anyone ever tries to tell you some kind of truism regarding whether it's better to hire a day labor versus contractor versus subcontractor, it's stupid. It's oversimplifying, basically. It's really oversimplifying. There's cases in which it's better or worse. Let me give you a more specific example that's maybe too specific for what some people are interested in, but I found out that I did a certain size house. We installed the porcelain tiles on the floor, and it was about 2 weeks of labor for 2 people. And then another time I did a similar size house, and I used a contractor. I paid him per square meter, and he finished the work in 1 week, and it was cheaper than the amount that I paid the other guys for 2 weeks. What are some differences? First of all, the guys that I paid per day, they actually did a slightly better job. The tiles overall were more perfectly level. The grout job was cleaner and more well done. But there wasn't a huge difference. Not to say the contractor rushed and did it quickly. He still did a very good job, and it was almost perfect. It just wasn't perfect, right? But it was good enough. The other difference was that the day laborer guys, the guy who knew how to do the tile work would do all the tile work with his assistant helping him. And then once that was all done, he would do all the grout work with the assistant helping him. What I saw with the subcontractor was that the subcontractor guy would do all the tiles. Once he finished one section of tiles, his helper would go and do the grout on that section because the helper was good enough to do grout. So they worked a bit more efficiently. So that's a situation which I would say, yeah, it's cheaper to, in that case, depending on the price per square meter they give you, it was cheaper to do a tile install with that. So that's probably all I have to say about contractors versus subcontractors versus day laborers. There's really a lot more that could be said. I don't want to get into a crazy amount of detail. Again, if anyone watching has questions, feel free to type in the chat. You have to be subscribed in the channel to type the question. So hit subscribe, and then you can ask me whatever question you want about construction in Ecuador. Another thing that's worth discussing are different types of contracts, right? So I already just mentioned subcontractors that are giving you per unit, per square meter, per linear meter contracts. For example, a gutter person will charge you per linear meter. A door person will charge you per door. The tile installer, plastering guys will charge you per square meter, right? So that's one kind of contract. Another kind of, then there's 2 other kinds, which are cost or cost plus, and then lump sum contracts. So the lump sum contract is what you're most familiar with, and a lot of people think all contracts are lump sum contracts if they haven't had much experience in building and things. So that's basically, the contractor comes, he looks at what he's going to do, and he says, all right, or he emails you a few days later and says, all right, it's going to cost this much. And he does it for that price. And it doesn't matter if his costs change or it takes him longer than he expected, whatever. He's expected to do the job for that price, and that's it. That's called a lump sum contract. And obviously that involves some risk for the contractor. So in the United States, what that means is that they're usually professional contractors, and they're really good at knowing how much it's going to cost, so they don't screw up much. Because if they did, they wouldn't be financially viable anymore. They would go insolvent and they would go out of business. So they have to be good at estimating that. It also means, obviously, their profit, say they're making 10, 20, 30% cut on top of the cost of the project, their profit is a cushion. So if the project actually, if the real costs are actually more than they expect, it cuts into their profit a little bit, but usually they don't actually end up losing money. But there is always a risk if the costs increase substantially, or if they're not very professional, they don't know how to estimate the cost properly, they end up losing money, which in a place like the United States is okay because the contractor is usually solvent enough to lose money on a couple projects and make money on a bunch more. In Ecuador, that's not the case. If you deal too much in lump sum contracts, you're going to find a lot of situations where the guys are unprofessional. They just don't finish the job. They stop. They come back a month later. They stop. They don't come back at all. You have to call them a bunch of times to get them to come back and finish. They start, oh, sorry, it costs a lot. It was a lot more than we expected. So can you give us a bit more money? And they start, well, then it's not really a lump sum contract anymore, is it? So be careful with lump sum contracts when you're building in Ecuador, because unless the contractor really knows what he's doing, or unless it's kind of like a small project, there's a good chance that it's not really what you think it is. You're going to have to end up paying more, or the project's not going to be done. And you can't like report them to the Better Business Bureau here. I mean, it's not like that does anything in the US anyways, but you could sue them. But yeah, it's better just to avoid those types of situations. The other type of contract I mentioned is a cost plus contract. That's where the client is responsible for the costs, and the contractor makes a set fee or percent on top of that. And that's also somewhat common, and that involves a lot less risk for the contractor, because that way, if the cost of materials increase, or if there's certain things that obviously there's things that are out of the contractor's control that can increase, and the contractor also doesn't have to be as perfect at making estimates, because it can cost a bit less or a bit more, and the client is going to pay either less or more. So if the cost of steel goes up 25% a couple months after you start the project, that cost is passed directly onto the client, the exact amount. Now, if the cost of the project ends up being 25, like there was a guy at Freehaven who built a pretty cheap thing. I estimated like it was going to be $2,200. At the end, it ended up being $1,800. So that $400 was his afterwards. If in a lump sum contract, it would have been the contractor would have pocketed that extra for good job for doing the job cheaper. The client would have never known, right? So the cost plus contract is great, but again, in Ecuador, you'll have contractors who didn't graduate high school, who don't really know how to do accounting, and hopefully they have like a wife or someone who's doing it for them, or it's a business that has a professional accountant on staff. Otherwise, you're dealing with a guy who doesn't really know how to add or subtract numbers, or doesn't save all the receipts, and he just kind of tells you how much it costs, and that can work. But just be careful with everything you're doing. What we often do at Freehaven or Terra Frutis is, what we always do is we keep detailed accounting records of every project that's a cost plus contract. So that way people can see a detailed list of every expense in the project in real time, compiled by our accountants. They can just log into the server and download their accounting file. Okay, this is exactly this. Last week they bought 25 bags of cement and a bunch of pieces of rebar and this and that for the project. That's reflected on here. So it's very, very, very transparent, which is great. That's what we want. We don't want sketchy lump sum contracts where the job's not done and contractors constantly asking for more money with no transparency or accountability whatsoever. It's starting to rain a little bit, so hopefully this microphone is working and y'all can still hear me. YouTube is funny with this stuff. I don't know. So I was talking about cost contracts versus lump sum contracts versus per unit or per meter contracts. Maybe it's a good idea to talk a little bit about wet climate building. So what are our limitations in the Amazon? What can we and can we not do? What do we have to consider when we're building in a climate with high rainfall and high humidity? Though the humidity here is not that high. When I lived in Connecticut, it's much more humid in the summer in Connecticut. It felt like you were swimming in the air. Here it's high humidity, but nowhere near as high, and it's moderate. It's constant. That's year round, day round, night. It doesn't really change much, except when it's sunny nonstop for like a week in a row. Then it feels a lot drier. But aside from that, yeah. So basically, you have to be careful of using things like plywood and MDF and OSB. So OSB and MDF are obviously plywood-like products that are made with particles or chunks of wood glued together. Those are tricky in this climate. I have used plywood successfully, and some people have, but it's not like an every use case kind of thing. Be careful using plywood. MDF and OSB I would not want to use for any serious construction. I've seen it used nearby here for like dividing walls in restaurants, and that great. It's cheap and temporary. They don't need it to last for 50 years. They're probably renting the building they're used for the restaurant, so they don't want to use anything expensive. So great, I'm getting some feedback that the sound is working fine. So obviously with a lot of rainfall and everything, you want to have wide roof eaves. People are used to seeing, like the house I grew up in Connecticut probably had a roof eave like this. Doesn't matter, right? But here we try to go for 50-centimeter roof eaves minimum on one-story buildings, minimum. Two-story buildings, I'm going 1 meter or 1.5 meters roof eave. That's the distance, horizontal distance between the wall and where the eave stops. So that's how much overhang you have that protects the lower parts of the building from rain, which is great. You want wide overhang. We've gone as far as 1.7 meters in some buildings. You know, it's great. It costs more. If you do the square meter calculation, that's a significant addition of area in the area of the roof. Now, Boris is talking in the chat. The warm tropical temperature means you don't have to dig too deep for the foundation like in a freezing climate. Yes, very good. So in Connecticut, the building code says you have to dig, even for a shed, you have to dig 4 feet down, 48 inches. Here, for a one-story building that is not super heavy, you can dig 50 centimeters because the ground, the earth is solid clay and you're fine. For most utility type buildings, we only go up to 50 centimeters. For 2 stories houses, we've gone to 80 centimeters to 1 meter. 80 centimeters to 1 meter is what I like to do, and then which is I guess 39 inches. And then for bigger buildings, obviously you need to go much deeper with much bigger footings. But that depends on the building. But you don't have to dig down to the frost line because you're doing it to prevent frost heave. In Connecticut, for example, when the ground thaws and freezes, your building can actually shift. Here, because we don't have that, that doesn't happen. So you just have to dig. The only important thing is digging to where the soil is firm. And if the soil is really firm and hard, 50 centimeters down with just hard clay and sandstone, what do you have to worry about? So you dig 60, 70 centimeters. For very small utility buildings, we'll go 20 centimeters because it's just a little cement footing right in clay. It's never going to move. Those buildings are fine years later. You can go deeper if you want, but so that's a nice thing about living in this climate, and also not having to worry about, like, somebody was asking me about when they were doing some wooden sheathing underneath their roof. They were saying, well, don't we have to space the wooden sheathing like a half an inch apart or a quarter inch to prevent it from expanding and contracting? So because we don't really have a freezing cold winter that causes the wood to expand and contract, and we don't have serious changes in humidity throughout the year like South Florida, for example, the wood pretty much stays the same. We have very, very tiny amounts of expansion and contraction. So it's great that we don't have to worry about it. So there's actually some benefits to being in a tropical, mild tropical climate. There's some things you save money on. So another thing that you have to consider, not just the eaves of the roof, but the slope of the roof. These like really flat roofs that you see are not good because you want the rain to come off it as quickly as possible, and also to wash any debris off it as quickly as possible. And the flatter it is, the more weight is on it. And also, if you have a horizontal surface and there's raindrops hitting it perpendicularly, that's more force, like that. If you do the math, the physics equations, if it's like this, it's hitting an angled surface and going down, it's deflecting it, so it's not as much force. So you get less erosion force of the rain hitting the perpendicular surface, the more like that it is. So it's good if your roofs are 45 degrees, 35 degrees. I know, like the sheet metal roofing that you see above me in the back of the video, I think if you look at the manufacturer's recommendation, the minimum roof slope, I know Cedric probably knows better than I, it's 17 or 20 degrees, something like that. But I would almost never make a roof here that only has 18 degrees slope. Even though the manufacturer said it's okay, the manufacturer says that's okay for cold climates with low rainfall. For the Amazon, I almost never want to go below 30 to 35 degrees. 45 degrees gets a bit crazier because it's hard to make wide roof eaves at 45 degrees, unless you do the whole roof shape mounted on top of the second floor, like a box gable or something. So the rain's getting loud again, but hopefully I think the microphone's close enough. Everyone can still hear me. Got a few viewers, that's good. I only announced this video a couple hours in advance, so maybe another time I'll give it a couple days and drum it all up, get a lot of people interested. So there's foundation, there's the roof eaves, roofing materials. All right, let's talk about roofing materials. So I'll go down the list. There's what you see above me, which is the corrugated carbon steel coated in zinc alloy. We call it just zinc sheet metal roof. Then there's the next step up, and that's the cheapest stuff. It'll last maybe 8 years. The next stuff up is the Galvalume. It's called Galvalume roofing in other countries. And so basically it's the same thing as carbon steel, except it's galvanized with a roughly 50% zinc and aluminum alloy. So Those of you who are worried about aluminum toxicity, maybe you want to avoid it. But on the other hand, costs about twice as much as the zinc roofing, but it lasts twice as long. So hey, it'd probably be good for 15 years, and then possibly more. Stuff above that is the fiber cement roofing, which looks like the old asbestos roof sheeting used to look, but it's not asbestos. It's fiber cement. It's fiberglass reinforced Portland cement roof sheeting. It has the corrugated shape. You got to paint it, otherwise it's the ugly gray cement color. And the benefit of that is it cuts down on the rain sound a lot. The rain is a lot quieter in the fiber cement roofing because it's thick and insulates. And it probably lasts comparable to the aluminum. And it has a 50-year guarantee, so maybe it lasts even longer. But in this kind of climate, I'm always a bit sketchy of the guarantees of exterior products. Above that, there's a similar product of fiberglass reinforced cement corrugated sheeting, but it looks like clay tiles. It has the clay tile formation, and it's painted and glazed to look just like clay tiles. And then there's also clay tile roofing, which lasts a really long time. We have an original clay tile roof on one of the community houses here, something like 70, 80 years old. 70, 75 years old, that roof. I think one time we took all the tiles off and cleaned them and reglazed them, but it's pretty impressive how long they can last. And they also insulate the rain sound really well. The downside, well, there's not much downside. They can break easier than the metal roofing, but if you don't have tree branches falling, I generally advise people not to have trees growing right next to their house for that reason. And if you don't glaze them, you should glaze them every 5 years, 10 years. Clean them off and glaze them so the surface lasts longer. Otherwise, it gets kind of black. Doesn't look that good after a long time. So, thank you, person who has French first name that I don't want to butcher. Gautier. Let's move on to the next topic here. We've got 4 viewers now. That's a record. So that's all. And I forgot to mention thatch roofing because everyone talks about thatch roofing. Okay, also asphalt roofing, because someone might ask. I've almost never seen asphalt roofing used in Ecuador. I think they're starting to use it now in the Andean region, the mountains, where it's cooler and drier. But in the Amazon, they probably won't use it because it won't last very long. And yeah, like I said, I very rarely ever see asphalt shingles here. Thatch roofing, which is made of usually either a grass or palm leaves, certain types of grass and certain types of palm leaves, that's bundled together in a tied with wire or a string. And then a bunch of those bundles are put in a line in rows on the roof really tight. And what you get at the end is a thatch roof. And those are great. And their lifespan is limited. I think they usually last 5 to 8 years here. You can supposedly get them to last up to 15 years in this climate, but I'm not entirely sure that that's possible. And in this climate, again, in a dry climate, a thatch roof can last many years. But here, for example, it's better on a 1-story building where you can light a fire inside, because supposedly every so often, like once a week, you're supposed to light a fire inside it, especially during the rainy season, to smoke out the thatch and keep it dry. So thatch roofs are great, but they are somewhat expensive in labor. If you have really cheap labor around, then they're cheaper. If you don't, then they're going to be about as expensive as a metal roof. James is asking, what are the requirements to become part of your community? Yes, it's helpful if you know how to make stairs. Well, there's 3 communities in this area. There's Fruit Haven, so you can go to fruithaven.org and click on Join Us, and it talks about, for example, you can come and stay here for a while, or you can buy land. It talks about what kind of people that we're looking for, and there's a questionnaire you can fill out. The same thing with Terra Frutis. You can go to terrafrutis.com and see options to buy land in that community or to join as a volunteer or community member. I'm just typing some URLs down here. And then there's a 3rd community, Evolution Ecovillage, which is also in this area, where you don't have the option to buy land, but people can stay there and live in little cabins and stuff. It's a cool place. They don't have a website, but you can search. I think you can search Evolution Ecovillage on Telegram and find their Telegram chat channel, whatever. So, yeah. Where I live is Fruit Haven, but we're very close and related to Terra Frutis and Evolution Ecovillage. So, I can talk about different building materials here and why we use certain materials. We tend to build a lot of houses out of wood, dimensional lumber. So people may ask, why don't you use bamboo and earthen materials. We do. There are some things projects we have done with those, with bamboo and wattle and daub and stuff like that. But there are some advantages to using lumber in this region. It lasts a really long time, much longer than bamboo, much longer than even treated bamboo. Because all the lumber that we're using here is not softwood. You can't use softwood here. The only thing we use softwood here is for temporary cement concrete forms, for cement buildings. All the wood here is extremely exotic tropical hardwood. It's very hard. Sometimes it's hard to get a nail in it. It does not rot. Termites, it's usually resistant to termite. Most of the woods here are somewhat resistant to termites and other boring insects. So we build using this really high quality wood, and the building can last 80 to 100. There was a house in Gualaquiza that was like 200 years old before it finally started to rot because the people who bought it stopped taking care of it. So hardwood can last, especially if the beams are big. The hardwood can last a really long time. So you could build a bamboo house that could last 30 years. People think lumber is automatically unsustainable, but hey, if you build a wood house in a way that lasts 100 years, that's probably more sustainable than building 3 bamboo houses during that time. The house should last as long as as old as the tree was that you cut down to build it. That's how long the house should last in order for it to be sustainable. So unfortunately, a lot of people in Ecuador build wood houses as kind of a temporary measure. They see wood houses as kind of like a poor thing, and their goal is always to live in a cement house. So they'll build a cheap, crappy wood house. Once the family gets enough money and a job, they get a bank loan, they build a concrete house, and they let the wood house kind of rot on the side of the property. It's unfortunate, but I see that a lot. Here at Fruit Haven and Terra Fruis, we try to build our buildings to last. So sometimes people want me to build a really cheap cabin for them, and I'll certainly do that, but I always prefer that. I know it's easy to say when it's somebody else doing it, but I always prefer that somebody will spend more money and build a quality house with wide roof eaves and thick wood, well done, so it'll last 80 years or 100 years. So that said, it's always possible to do things for cheaper. So lumber is great. The other thing is a lot of the construction workers are very familiar with lumber, so no special training is needed. Obviously, a lot of brick and cement work is done here as well. It's just the tropics. Brick and cement is very good for areas with moisture. You don't have to worry so much about rot and termites. Some people prefer to build all brick and cement. At one of the Fruit Haven properties right now, we're building a house that's all brick with a clay tile roof. So that house is going to last a very long time. There's very little wood in it. So brick and cement are obviously more expensive than lumber, and it's more labor. And if your house is far away, like up the mountain at Fruit Haven, it's going to cost a lot more money to transport all that brick and cement and gravel up there than it will be to build a wood house from wood that's sourced a bit more locally, or where you don't have to haul quite as much weight up the mountain in the dump truck or with the horses or whatever, however you're doing it. Metal is also, well, sometimes you use metal for roof structures. We have some roofs where the structural beams for the roof are all metal, which is great because it costs similar to wood, and it lasts a long time. The only downside, I would say, if it starts getting rusty in some years, sanding and painting metal is really a pain in the butt. Whereas retreating wood is very easy. You can give it a light hand sand, and you could either paint it again or stain it again. It's very easy. Whereas metal is quite a thing. But another thing I would say about, back at the beginning of the video, I was talking about Ecuadorian contractors and things to watch out for when they take shortcuts on your building. They can metal beams that are used in the structure of the roof, they'll often paint them with anti-corrosive metal paint, but they won't paint it with primer first. And I find that makes a difference. If it's not painted with primer properly first, surface rust of the metal will get through to the paint much sooner, like maybe in 5 years. But I think if you paint it with a good primer first, and then the second coat with a good anti-corrosive paint after that, I believe it'll take a lot longer for any rust to show. So you don't have to do that whole sanding with the angle grinder and getting all the paint off and repainting it. That's a serious. Glass, windows, and screens. We don't often use glass in the windows. Even in the cities, even people with money, they often don't have glass in their windows. They just have screen. Why? Because the temperature in this region is very stable year-round. It doesn't ever get too cold or too hot. So it's great. In Cuenca, in the cities where it's a lot colder here, they'll use glass because it gets cold, and you want to close the glass window. In Guayaquil on the coast, they'll use glass because they use air conditioning there because it's a lot hotter on the coast. But here in the Amazon, you can save money. You don't have to have glass in your windows. If you're worried about security, glass sucks anyways. Just put one of those metal bar grids over the windows. You can make it fancy if you want. and that'll stop people from breaking in. And then all you have to do is have a aluminum screen on the windows. Unless maybe you're up at the very top of the mountain at Freehaven, maybe it gets a bit too cool at night. For plumbing, I can talk about plumbing and water a bit. As I said before, if anyone has any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. Plumbing and water, we often mostly use polypropylene plumbing pipes in the buildings. Polypropylene is pretty stable, fairly inert. It's not anywhere near as toxic as PVC. I know a lot of people use PVC. Automatically, Ecuadorian contractors and plumbers automatically will use polypropylene, which is red, for the hot water, and the blue PVC for the cold water. At Fruithaven and Terra Fruities, generally we use polypropylene for both hot and cold water. Despite polypropylene being more expensive than PVC, it is less toxic and more stable, so we prefer to use it for everything. Another option is obviously copper. A lot of people assume that copper is more natural and better. Copper is actually very toxic, especially the solder for copper, to weld the pipes together, often has lead in it. And a lot of people have copper toxicity because drinking water from copper plumbing pipes their entire lives, like me, for example. So, but the other reason we don't use copper is not so much because I know plastic is toxic too, so polypropylene also has slight toxicity issues. I would prefer to drink from polypropylene pipes than copper pipes, especially after learning a lot about copper toxicity in the last year or so. I would definitely prefer to use polypropylene, but the other thing is copper is more expensive, so polypropylene pipes are cheaper than copper pipes. So PVC is cheaper, but we're not going to go that cheap because we do care about our health. Now, the exterior of the buildings for our water systems and for irrigation, for example, running to garden hoses and stuff, we'll use the infamous black plastic hose, which is a hard hose made of HDPE or high-density polyethylene. And so our water systems are often, we find a spring or a stream up in the mountain, we'll run 500 meters of 2-inch HDPE hose, which is flexible hose, down through the forest. And once it gets to somebody's lot, we'll run it to their house. The difference in altitude creates a large amount of pressure. So you can have enough pressure for a hose, sprinkler, shower, faucet, whatever. Yes, if I were you, I would not drink from a copper water bottle. I know it's promoted as being very healthy, but look online, do some reading about copper toxicity. Check out some videos by Dr. Garrett Smith on YouTube. His channel is called Nutrition Detective. He talks about copper toxicity. Just read about that. I know there's some people online that are pushing that you should take copper supplements and it's very good for you, but I don't believe so. So I don't know. Sorry if you spend a lot of money on the copper water bottle, but no, I mean, copper is a natural metal, but it's a heavy metal and a lot of people are toxic in it. So anyways, so about the water systems, yeah, so those water systems give us plenty of pressure. So we'll use the HDPEs once we get up to the houses, and then for the plumbing inside the house, we'll often use polypropylene tubing. And if someone's trying to be really cheap, then we'll just use the HDPE for everything. Because like I said, if someone wants to do something cheap, we'll do it cheap. The downside to using HDPE for interior plumbing is that it tends to be a bit more leaky at the connections, because it's just a connection that you heat it, pop it over, and put a clamp on. Whereas the polypropylene, we're threading it and putting Teflon tape or thread sealant. I know Teflon is bad, but generally, if it's done properly, you shouldn't touch the water. Or we can use thread sealant, which hopefully is not as toxic as the Teflon. In the end, yeah, you can catch rainwater off your roof if you want much more pure water. Because I think drinking pure water is pretty important. We also have, for people who are interested in water filtration, you can get reverse osmosis water filtration systems in Ecuador. And those actually don't use a lot of electricity, much less than a distiller. So you can run those off a solar power system fairly easily. So if somebody wants an RO reverse osmosis system in their house, very easy. There are plenty of distributors here in Ecuador, those types of systems. We can also get cylindrical activated carbon filters and other types of water filters, and just general sediment filters as well. Yeah. Let's see if there's any other, hot water heaters. Another common question I get, what do we do for hot water? Well, the most common hot water heater that we use here is the on-demand LPG hot water heater. Well, what is LPG, you might ask? You probably know it as propane. It's not actually propane. It's what comes in those cylindrical bottles. But Pure propane is more expensive, and that's not what they use here. LPG is known as liquefied petroleum gas, and it's a blend of gases that I believe includes propane, but we just commonly call it propane. So it's a hot water heater that's like rectangle shaped that mounts to your wall. That's like that big, and it's on demand. But honestly, they use them in hotels here. Even they're incredible. Those like big tank electric hot water heaters they have in the U.S. unnecessary. I guess they're good because they're insulated in cold climates. But here, for showers, hot water, whatever, we'll use one of those, and they're about $300 each for a hot water heater for a whole house. And they're great. So we use those. And of course, solar hot water heater is another option, but obviously it's not sunny all the time. So when it's cloudy out, you're not going to have hot water. When it's sunny, you're going to have pretty warm, somewhat hot water. So there's solar hot water heaters. Some people do have them, but they're not that reliable. So if you want always reliable hot water, you can get the LPG one. Of course, there are options of, I know we've all seen these videos on YouTube of these like copper coils above a fire, above like a jet stove, a rocket stove. Sorry, jet stove. A rocket stove. That kind of hot water heater, and those are great, but no one's built one here yet just because you basically have to design it yourself and fabricate it. There are plenty of metal shops that will fabricate whatever you want. So you could do that, but it's a lot more maintenance to have one of those systems. You have to make sure it works well. The water coming out of it is going to be super, super like scalding hot, so you can't mess up with it. You have to be feeding the jet stove. The LPG hot water heaters can be converted to biogas. If you drill the nozzles differently, if you know what you're doing with biogas. Any questions anyone has about construction in Ecuador, anything I've talked about so far, feel free to ask below, or even general questions. I'm going to move on to another topic here. So I mentioned some more natural materials before, because I talked about lumber, brick, cement, metal, glass, all that stuff. But bamboo, of course, bamboo is readily available here. You can build structures with bamboo. We have built some structures with bamboo. The main reason we don't do more is cost versus longevity. People assume, I don't know, they come here with all these crazy assumptions, and they kind of assume that building a bamboo house will be almost free, but bamboo still costs. It takes a long time to grow it, so if you buy it from somebody who has it, it still costs not as much as wood, but it costs. Transporting it costs. Building with it is more labor than wood, so your labor cost is going to be higher with a bamboo building than a wood building. It's harder to seal it against insects and bugs, and a lot of Westerners want totally bug-sealed house. So bamboo, we've used it as a component in wattle and daub earthen walls, so it's really good for that. And we built some, like I said, we've done some things with bamboo, but people generally don't prefer it because of the reasons that I just mentioned. It's not as cheap as they think, doesn't last as long as wood, and it's more labor to work with than wood. So, but still, it's great, and we will build bamboo structures for people here if they want them. Sometimes almost similar to bamboo, like this building I'm in, you see these, you can't really see in the video, but this structure is built with round wood poles, and it's basically just like with bamboo, except it's not bamboo because there's these, the forest around here is full, absolutely full of these like 10-centimeter wide poles, like these trees that grow up everywhere. It's super dense, and it's hardwood. So we'll just go and harvest a bunch of those and make a structure with them. We use those basically the same way we would use bamboo, except it lasts longer than bamboo would because it's hardwood, and they grow like crazy. So that's kind of like our substitute. So I mentioned wattle and daub. I'm going to type that in here for those of you who don't understand what I'm saying. The words wattle and daub. Basically, you're building a frame of sticks woven in a certain way, and then you're slapping mud and manure and grass, cow manure or grass, and sand and clay and limestone mixed together in a certain ratio. You slap it on there, and then you make a finer texture layer. You slap that on to plaster it. You have a nice thick earthen wall, very insulative, very resistant to sound. We did some, they're currently doing some wattle and daub walls on the dining hall at Terra Frutis. So if you want to see that in action, you can come to the Amazon Fruit Festival from January 17 to 23, this coming January, here in Ecuador, which is in South America, not Central America, at Terra Frutis community. You can go to AmazonFruitFestival.com. And you'll see there, actually, I'm sorry, not the dining hall, the kitchen. The kitchen there where you put wattle and daub walls to help with the sound, the blender noise and stuff. So that's one. And there's a house at Fruit Haven where the guy put earthen walls, and I think it was wattle and daub technique. It's a very great technique. So we can make a building frame with wood and then do wattle and daub walls instead of wood walls. They can have some cracks in them, but and then of course rammed earth is another good option. I think rammed earth is great. We just haven't tried it here. It requires some specialized equipment. If you don't want to do it all manually, you got to use like a pneumatic tamper, which we don't have, and a big air compressor, which we don't have yet, like a big one, you know. And basically you make forms like you would with poured cement, but instead of pouring cement in them, you put layers of earth and like clay and sand at a certain ratio and limestone at a certain ratio. Throw it all in there. Each layer you tamp it, compact it pneumatically. You end up with a crazy resistant building that's resistant to earthquake, resistant to impacts, resistant to moisture because it's compacted so quickly. Somebody's asking, tried any earth ships? From what I remember, earth ship is a very creatively made building using a lot of different recycled materials. Like for example, tires, glass bottles, pieces of shipping containers, and metal from junkyards and cars, and all kinds of stuff you can throw together. I've seen pictures of these. I think this is what you're talking about. We haven't built any here. I think somebody will at some point, but it hasn't been done yet. We don't have like dozens and dozens and dozens of houses here at Fruithaven or Terra Fruits yet. We have 30 buildings. I don't know. We haven't counted at both places. Somewhere around there, but we haven't made such a wide variety. Also, people tend to stick with what they know works so really well, so they don't, you know. I'm sure someday someone will build an earthship here. Now, some things that I would pretty confidently say should not be tried here. Number one, straw bale. Straw bale construction is really awesome, but I don't think it should be done in a humid tropical climate, partly because straw is not really available here. People don't feed hay to horses in winter, and there's not any wheat fields. Maybe up in the Andes there's wheat fields, but they don't sell bales of straw here in the stores. But anyways, it wouldn't last much long in this climate. It's humid. And then earth bag, right? Okay, so earth bag, I had this in the list of things people shouldn't try here. No, earth bag should work here, but it's you can do an earth bag, you can do earth bag walls, but you can't do an earth bag dome. Don't do domes here. The thing about the high rainfall is it's constant rainfall on the dome all year. So unless you're every year you're retreating it with a somewhat toxic glaze material, it's going to have erosion. Whether it's an aircrete dome, a hempcrete dome, a concrete dome, an earthen dome, an earth bag dome, because an earth bag dome is basically polyester sacks filled with sand or clay, cement mixed together, with a row of barbed wire to stop it from shifting in layers, and then you plaster over that. Now the plaster is what's going to wear away in the constant the rain. Now it's not monsoon here, but it certainly rains a fair amount, you know. So I wouldn't recommend doing domes here. Glass dome is a great idea. You would eventually get some erosion, eventually. So yeah, I think a glass dome with a metal frame would work pretty well. That'd be somewhat expensive. But yeah, earthen dome, no, and yeah, for earth bag, no one's done an earth bag building here. Yeah, I think it would be a good experiment. But earth bag's another one of those things where people sometimes don't do because they don't realize how much it costs. They always assume everything's going to be pretty much free if it's like a DIY kind of thing. Oh, just get a bunch of sacks, fill them with dirt, and throw them on top of each other, and I got myself a house. But it's like that amount of sacks costs a good amount of money. The barbed wire, if you do the math, that goes in between the rows costs money. The foundation that you do below the sacks costs money. The cement and the rebar, or the stone and the cement below that. The plaster on both sides costs money, and it's a lot of labor. So unless you have a team of people to do it, volunteer for months, you have to pay workers to do it. And Ecuador has cheap labor, but it's not as cheap as like Asia, you know. So sometimes people think of these ideas and I'm like, yeah, that's a good idea, but it's not going to cost you much less than a wood house, and the wood house will have these other benefits and it'll last longer and da 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 da. So for that reason, I'm sure someday we'll have an earth bag house and an earth ship here. It just hasn't happened yet. But we do have some bamboo structures. We have some wattle and daub stuff done. We have a lot of wood buildings, and we have some cement and brick buildings. So yeah, I hope that people will do more wattle and daub here in the future. I think it's great. I think wood structure with wattle and daub walls is awesome. So maybe I'll do some of that in some of my structures. For now, I'm just using a lot of wood. And partly like the walls in this building I'm in, what you see behind me, the walls down here, it's like we'll cut the trees into lumber, and there's outer sections that have bark. They're like these kind of semicircle profile pieces. that the Ecuadorians will usually just leave in the wood to rot, but we pull them all in and we dry them and we use them for walls because they're great. Why let them go to waste? So I could have done wattle and daub on these, but instead I used kind of this sort of waste wood product, but it's still hardwood. All right, so that is all of the topics that I had on my list. And it's raining pretty hard now. It's kind of hard. I'm sure you guys can probably hear me because of the microphone, but I can't hear myself that well. It just happened to start raining. It was nice all day long, and then right when I started the video, it started raining. So that's kind of annoying. But I don't have any more topics on my list. So if anybody has any questions, post them in the chat. You're gonna have to subscribe to the channel if you want to post a question. But that's good. All right, I'll do more. Oh, you know what? I can wear earplugs for my next live stream if it's raining, and then I'll be fine. So, all right, so we got a question about the mosquito problem. Yes, now is a good time for any off-topic questions that people might have. Give me 1 second. I'm actually going to put a pair of earplugs in so I can hear myself speak in this rain that apparently none of you can hear. Although Boris can hear because he's down the hill. All right, that's perfect. All right, so mosquitoes. There are not very many mosquitoes here in terms of actual mosquitoes, right? When I live in Connecticut, I got bit by way more mosquitoes in the summer. I lived in Florida, swarms of mosquitoes. Here, it's rare for me to get bit by a mosquito. When it rains a lot for like 3 days in a row, then some mosquitoes will start to come out, sure. And there is a possibility of getting dengue fever or chikungunya here. Very rare, only not many people have gotten it. I got it once, but no big deal. You survive. Mosquito, but there are gnats. Now, the no-see-ums, and they tend to bite new people for a few months. So some people say, oh, there's a lot of bugs, I got bothered by the bugs, but once you stick around for a couple months, the gnats don't really bother you anymore because you don't smell dew anymore and your body gets used to it, so they don't react as much to the bites, so it's nothing. So basically, for anyone who's been here for a while, the bugs aren't much of an issue, but when you're new here, the gnats tend to bother you. But the mosquitoes, generally, there's not many mosquitoes now. Down by the river, lower elevation, there's more gnats. Up here in the mountains where I am, up, for example, the upper parts of Freehaven 1, 2, 3, and 9, there's a lot less gnats, but when it rains, there tends to be a little bit more mosquitoes up here, but not very noticeable. So Boris has a question. He says, my question regarding the zinc roof, do you know how is the process to replace them, cost, etc.? And is it possible to change them to clay tile instead when they rust? Yeah, so when they rust, they can rust for a while before you have to replace them if you don't care about how it looks. You can paint them before they start to rust, and that'll get them to last a lot longer. But if you don't paint them and they start to rust, even when they start to get holes, it'll just be 1 or 2 holes, and you can just put that tar patching material over it, and you can go quite a while without having to replace it. And zinc, the zinc the galvanization of zinc is actually somewhat self-healing, which is interesting. Weird for a metal, but anyways, once you have to replace it, sometimes if there's no holes in it, it just looks rusty, they flip it to the other side, but then you see the rust on the inside, and that's ugly. But other than that, it's just taking them off and putting new sheets on. If you want to replace a zinc roof with a clay tile roof, 2 things to consider are this. First of all, is the slope sufficient? Because a clay tile roof really needs minimum 35-degree slope. You want the water running off that clay tile, so it's not a lot of weight, and so like mildew and moss will start to grow on the clay tiles, which slowly breaks them down if the roof is flatter. But if it's steep roof, the water runs off quicker, it dries quicker, erodes the clay quicker, erodes the clay less, and then it's better. So if your roof is already steep enough, then you can replace it with clay tiles, but you have to install the second thing. You have to install a lot more purlins, because the zinc roof sheets will have 1 purlin, which is the little piece of wood the roof sheet is mounted on, about every meter. The clay tiles need one about every 35 centimeters, depending on the clay tile measurement. So you need to add a lot more purlins to install the clay tile roof. The other thing to consider is sometimes a building will have actually been built, especially if somebody wants a really cheap building, the building will have been built with a lightweight roof in mind. So if you're switched from a very lightweight roof to a very heavy roof, you might have to add some additional bracing, because I've seen instances where clay tiles, the weight of the tiles will actually start bending some of the beams in the building because people didn't calculate that the fact that the clay tile roof is really heavy. And so if the building is strong enough, then clay tile is no problem. But If it was built without a plate tile roof in the future in mind, then it should be analyzed if you need to add additional beam or additional bracing to make it stronger. All right, another question here in the chat, non-construction related, but that's okay. How do locals look at foreigner communities like yours? Well, different locals have different opinions of this. So there's locals that love us, and there's locals that don't like us. There's not very many locals that don't like us. Most of them are somewhat okay with us. And again, it says communities like yours, so there's a difference between communities as well. We happen to employ a lot of people because we're building houses, we're planting fruit forests. There's a lot of owners who aren't here at their lots right now, and they're in other countries. They're making money, they're sending it here, they're having stuff done. Then once they can move here, or they want to live here 6 months every year, their house is ready and everything. So because generally, if you're a foreigner providing employment and you're doing it in a good way and not ripping people off, they're going to like you, right? So, so that's good. Of course, they see us as weird because we're foreigners, and that's normal. We look weird to them, and they look weird to us, and they have their culture, and we have ours. And there's always things about living in a totally different country. You see, like, people talking about like gringos living in gated communities in like Mexico and Ecuador and stuff, and there's like this thing to live in. Well, Fruit Haven does not have a gate yet, but tell you what, when they make the public road to Fruit Haven, when the government finally makes the road that goes down the river and Fruit Haven has total road access, not just by the walking bridge, we're going to put in a gate. But the thing about the gated community stereotype, what they don't tell you in those articles, like most of the gated communities in Ecuador are not foreigners, they're Ecuadorians. Any city, like you go to Cuenca and the outer parts of the city, there's tons of gated communities, and they're all populated by Ecuadorians. There's a few that have some foreigners in them, but most of them are free Ecuadorian gated communities. So there's not this thing about like foreigners living in their individual communities. Ecuadorians also have private communities as well. Yeah. Oh, hi, Sarah. Thanks. Yeah, it's pretty warm. Yeah. Now would be a good time if anybody has, we're approaching the 1 hour mark, so I don't want to go too much longer. And that would be a good time if anybody has any other questions, either related to construction or not, so I can go off on a tangent for another couple minutes before I finish the video. While anyone's watching is thinking of more questions. But it's a good time to mention that if you're interested in coming down here and checking out the area and possibly considering spending your apocalypse with us, because pretty obvious the end times are approaching, you should come down to the Amazon Fruit Festival in January. This coming January, 17 to 23. You can buy a ticket online, camping ticket, cabin ticket, cabin or camping. It's going to be a great festival. AmazonFruitFestival.com here in Southeast Ecuador, where we serve lots of, we actually serve a lot of, it's like raw vegan gourmet food all week. So we serve like pizza and lasagna and spaghetti and I don't know, curry noodles and cheese, all kinds of crazy stuff, but it's all made with vegetables and nuts and fruits and stuff. So it's pretty cool. Really super delicious gourmet food. Yeah, I got a question here. Did I cut my hair? Yes, I cut my hair. Yeah, it was long and I got tired of it. So it feels great now. Nice. Last time I cut it was like maybe 6 or 7 years ago, something like that. It was a while ago. All right, somebody just said the word economy in the chat. I'm not sure if that's not a question, it's just a word. So anyways, all right, so aside from the Amazon Fruit Festival, if you're interested in getting involved in Fruit Haven or Terra Frutis, you can go to our websites, which I linked above in the chat, terrafruitis.com and fruithaven.org. Generally, what we're trying to do here is people can live on their private lots, build their houses, plant their fruit trees. We, as a community, we do have a focus on security. We don't want to be like those people in Vilcabamba that get robbed at night because they don't pay any attention to security until there's a gun in their face and a robber in their home. We don't want that to happen here, We haven't had anything like that happen here, but we don't want it to happen. So we're not going to make ourselves targets. So we pay attention to security. We are a safe community. We have community security. We have two-way radios. We have scary dogs. We have all that stuff. And then we're also interested in surviving when the shall we say, certain global powers begin their, shall we say, event that reduces the quantity of people in the world, right? So we want to be able to survive all that in a reasonable way. We want to get through it all. So we're looking for, good, strong-willed people who, who want to come to a place like this and live out with us. And we recognize, of course, staying here long-term and surviving financially is difficult. So it's good if people have an online job or some foreign source of income. But it is possible to make money here, especially if you know Spanish. I work way too much. And one of the reasons that I can't work less is because there's not enough people here that know Spanish to do the things that I do, both Spanish and English, because obviously there's plenty of people who know Spanish that are Ecuadorian, but bilingual people. If you come, I barely knew Spanish when I came here. It was not hard to learn. You just have to apply yourself. But even without knowing Spanish, there are ways to make money here. There are people who make money here doing certain things. And as the community grows, it'll only be easier and easier. We'll have kind of our own mini economy. Oh, there's the word economy. That was in the chat. That we'll have our mini economy forming. It'll be possible for people to come here and like, oh yeah, there's jobs available here that don't pay $3 an hour or $2.50 an hour, which is the average local wage here. So, and the cost of living in Ecuador is pretty low, so you don't need a lot of money to get by. Certainly, if you want to come here and buy a big lot of land and build a $30,000 house, of course you need a bunch of money. But aside from that, there's always people here that need house sitting. There's usually cheap rental or camping or volunteer options. If you don't think you have enough money to live here, it might even be possible. Where there's a will, there's a way. When I came down here, I didn't have very much, money. A lot of people don't, so it's only going to get worse. Inflation is still skyrocketing. Energy prices in Europe are skyrocketing. Silver, pay attention to the silver market in the next week or so. Things are starting to get interesting. And we'll leave it at that. There's no more questions in the chat. Hope you all enjoyed the live stream. Talked about construction quite a bit. Yeah, where there's a will, there's a way. Have a good evening, everybody. Share this video with your friends who are interested in construction in Ecuador, and make sure you go to freehaven.org, terrafruitus.com, amazonfruitfestival.com. Tell your mom.